This is the Shahid Shah Show. Straight talk on building, buying, and investing in digital health. No hype, no buzzwords, no speculation. Just what actually works, maybe what doesn't, and most importantly, why. If you're building healthcare technology or buying it, this is where reality shows up.
Here's a question I've been sitting on for years. Why do genuinely smart people, well motivated, resourced, often brilliantly creative people who are trying to solve real healthcare problems keep running into the same few potholes when they're trying to sell to health systems? Not because they're naive, not because health systems are impossible, mostly because healthcare has a way of looking familiar from a distance and then revealing up close that the steering wheel is on the other side, the pedals are labeled in Latin, and someone from compliance would like to review what color your shoes are. I say that with affection, of course. This is a very, very hard market because the work matters, the stakes are high, and the people inside healthcare delivery organizations are carrying much more responsibility than any org chart can politely admit. So, my hypothesis is this: selling to a healthcare delivery organization requires you to hold two ideas in your head at the same time. Healthcare will move very slowly. It's also under constant, urgent pressure to change. It's full of people who want better tools and has very little bandwidth to adopt them. Leaders sign contracts and still need hundreds or thousands of humans to change behavior before those contracts become outcomes. If you operate on only one of these truths at a time, the other one will tap you gently on the shoulder, usually during month 9 of the sales cycle, while holding a spreadsheet. So today I'm going to walk through 12 lessons, not as verdicts, not as here's where everybody messes up. Think of this more like a friendly field guide from somebody like me who's spent a lot of time walking in these trails, occasionally with a map, occasionally with wet socks. We're going to go through them in order of cost. So think about the earlier ones that I talk about as being the most expensive, and the latter ones being educational and helpful, hopefully. So let's begin with what I believe is one of the most expensive unanswered questions in health tech sales. Before your next pilot, before you commit to the resources, before you negotiate the terms, before you design the success metrics, answer this one question out loud. Who, specifically by name and title, has committed to funding the production contract if the pilot you want to run succeeds? Oh, and by the way, what exact budget line is going to be driving that pilot? Don't worry about who's excited. Don't worry about who's attending every meeting and encouraging things and who your champion is. All that really matters is who has the authority to approve the spending and, more importantly, has already indicated that they will. If you can get this answer pretty quickly, you're ahead of most good companies. If the answer feels a little soft, like there's someone who is very enthusiastic and surely enthusiasm has a budget code, then you have just discovered something important early enough to do something about it. Now, here's why this happens. Founders are not naive about money. They understand contracts and budget cycles and procurement processes. But the specific question of where production funding comes from can feel awkward to ask before the pilot begins. It can feel too soon, too transactional. The relationship feels collaborative and good. Everyone is leaning forward. The room that has the lovely, hey, we're all going to improve healthcare together energy, and nobody wants to be the person who slides a budget question into the middle like a tax accountant at a wedding. But the question is not rude. It is respectful. It respects your time, their time, and the possibility that the pilot might actually work. The lesson is not that ROI doesn't matter. Return on investment matters enormously. It's that ROI is a clinical, operational argument, and you also, especially today, need a financial argument. Those are often two separate conversations with two different audiences. The second one needs to begin before the first one concludes. What becomes possible when you solve this problem of who pays for the pilot after it's done? You stop treating the pilot as the destination. You start treating it as an opening act for the conversation that turns useful results into durable work. Lesson 2. Here's a quick thought experiment. Imagine you've spent 18 months building a relationship. The clinical champion is genuinely excited. The pilot data is solid. Everyone agrees that the value is real. And then the deal slows down because a 40-page security questionnaire revealed a data handling practice that should have been corrected 17 months ago. How does that happen? It happens because compliance can look like paperwork until the moment it becomes a stage gate. And by month 18 of a sales cycle, nobody wants to discover a gate. At that point, everyone was hoping for a ribbon, maybe a pen, possibly a modest celebration pastry. So here's the better question. What would have had to change about how you think about sales for compliance to feel like a trust building feature rather than administrative cost? Compliance should be thought of as a sales enablement tool. The startups that crack this don't treat HIPAA and security reviews as things to endure. They treat them as a way to earn trust before they have earned anything else. They walk into the first meeting with the security questionnaire already completed. The BAA template is ready. The data handling documentation exists and it's accurate. And what they discover is that the healthcare IT and legal teams, who are used to bracing themselves for a long compliance conversation, feel relieved. That relief is the competitive advantage. It is the sales enablement tool. Clearing that bar is faster and more cleanly than expected is a genuine edge in your procurement process. What if the question wasn't, how do we get through compliance, but how do we become the easiest compliance conversation this health system has had all year? Lesson 3. Let me pose a small logic puzzle. You're talking to a well-known academic medical center. They tell you, if you get our logo on your website, every other health system in the country will pay attention. The next week, you're talking to a different well-known academic medical center. They tell you something simple. In a third and fourth and a fifth, same thing over and over again. Get our logo and everybody else will be easier to sell. At what point does this math ask for a chair and a glass of water? I've discussed this version of this conversation with health leaders many, many times, and the responses are revealing. Most of them smile because they understand the dynamic. The prestige is real. I went to a large academic medical center. We piloted there, and therefore, the pride is earned. They are serious institutions doing serious work. But our logo changes everything is usually only partially true. A prestigious deployment does tell the market that your product survived a rigorous clinical environment. That's a real signal. It's not just the same as everyone will follow. It's closer to you are now credible enough to get a meeting somewhere you could not get one before. That's what you want to focus on is getting the logo helps you with the next meeting. Getting the logo gives you some level of credibility so that a next hospital will talk to you. Sometimes it's worth a lot. It's just not a market adoption strategy. Logos are social proof. Logos are not licenses to be able to sell to another organization just because one organization approved it. So try to stop evaluating logo opportunities by symbolic weight and start asking which endorsement opens a specific door with a specific buyer who has a specific problem and a real budget to solve in your next sales lead action. That's a much more answerable question. It also leads to a much healthier relationship with prestige. Respect the logo, of course. Just don't ask it to do all your chores. Lesson 4. Here's one that reveals something useful about the difference between how evidence works in medicine and how evidence works in procurement. The inference seems airtight. Healthcare is evidence-based. Of course, rigorous clinical evidence should drive technology adoption. Reasonable premise, reasonable inference. So why doesn't it always work that way? Consider what is already deployed in health systems across the country. Many enterprise technologies become dominant through incentives, purchasing momentum, integration dependencies, and the practical reality that everyone else was just using them. That doesn't mean evidence is unimportant. It means evidence has a job, and it is not the only employee in the building. Evidence is enormously powerful with formulary committees, with certain payer audiences, with chief medical informatics officers who need to justify a purchasing decision to a skeptical board, and with clinical leaders who want confidence that the tool will help rather than merely arrive. At the right moment in the relationship with the right audience, evidence can convert a skeptic into a champion. The question worth sitting with is not, does evidence matter? It is, who is this evidence for? And when in the conversation does it become the thing that moves them? Evidence is a trust accelerant in the right hands at the right time. Knowing when it is useful and what other proof the buyer still needs is the real skill. Lesson 5. This one asks us to be honest about a premise that feels like it should be true and turns out only to be partially true. Is the market for healthcare technology rational? By rational, I mean, does the product at a given price point reliably displace the incumbent? Spend time in this industry and you're going to learn the answer is not automatically. That is not because healthcare systems cannot tell quality. They can. It is because replacing technology in healthcare is rarely a software decision. It is an organizational commitment wearing a software hat. Think about what switching actually involves. You're retraining staff who have built their fluency around a different system. You're rebuilding integrations. You're managing clinical risk during a transition when everyone is operating at lower proficiency than normal. And you're asking clinical leaders to stake their professional credibility on an outcome they can't predict. It's a lot to ask, even when your product is better. Or maybe, especially because your product is better. So here's a question that changes the strategic frame. Instead of only asking, how do we prove we're better? What if you asked, how do we reduce the cost of switching until it stops being the actual decision? Because people are not just saying, is your product great? It is, holy cow, what's it going to cost me to switch from what I have into your new product? And what you have might just be the status quo where there's no technology, but it's still a switching cost. And so it's a big, big deal. Those are different problems. One is demonstrating superiority. My product is better. The other is about reducing friction. In my experience, the second one wins far more often because it meets the health system where the real resistance lives, and that is switching. Lesson 6, briefly, because it's worth naming with kindness. When you mention your most recent funding round in a health system sales conversation, what responses are you expecting? I just got $15 million in funding from XYZ VC fund. Many founders expect something like, impressive, smart investors, serious people believe in this. And sometimes that is exactly what happens. Rarely. Funding can signal that you have a support, ambition, and runway. But the buyer may also be thinking quite reasonably, will this company still be here in 3 years? If they succeed, are they going to get bought? If they don't succeed, can they support us well? Even with all this money, the money's going to run out at some point. Will they be profitable? Will they understand our implementation cannot be run on a demo day adrenaline? Venture funding tells investors something important about a market opportunity at a moment in time. It tells a health system procurement committee something useful but incomplete. What health systems can evaluate more directly is evidence of the problem you solve, proof that you have solved it elsewhere in comparable environments, and signals that you understand their operational reality. Lead with those. The round size, how much money you raise, is not the whole argument. If you're just tuning in, this is the Shahid Shah Show, where we cut through the noise in digital health and talk honestly, constructively, and practically about how healthcare technology gets built, bought, deployed, and paid for. Today, we're exploring the patterns that keep health tech companies from succeeding with healthcare delivery organizations, and more importantly, what those patterns reveal about how we get it right. Now, let's take the buyer side of the table, because there's a second set of lessons that health system leaders are often sitting with, but rarely say out loud. Not because they're trying to hide anything, of course. Usually because a sales conversation is early, everyone is being polite, and nobody wants to turn a promising meeting into a group therapy session with procurement notes. So let me say some of what they might say if the setting were a little bit more candid. So lesson 7, here's a question everybody in the health system buyer would benefit from asking before signing a contract. They would ask, how many of your product decisions were actually validated by practicing frontline clinicians in environments like ours? Not on your advisory board, not on your reference customer in ordinary, busy, understaffed clinical settings where the printer is making a concerning sound and someone is already late for a clinic. The answer reveals a lot about whether physician adoption is going to happen. There's a heuristic in clinical software that is not always fashionable to say out loud, but it's very, very real. If a physician cannot feel the value within 4 minutes of using a tool for the first time, they're going to find a way to work around it, especially if there's not a significant amount of training that usually happens with large EHR and very, very large ERP settings. Most systems do not go through that. Not because they're opposed to change, because they have patients to see, notes to finish, inbox of messages multiplying quietly in the background, and there's no slack to invest in something that might pay off eventually, like your tool. The question we're sitting with is, what would it take to design your product for that moment? Not the demo environment, not the implementation kickoff with a motivated champion, but the first time a tired physician opens it on a Tuesday afternoon without any context and needs to understand immediately whether it's going to help or add work. The companies that answer this question with real observation, sitting with actual clinicians, sitting with, watching where their attention goes, understanding what friction feels like from the inside, and then producing adoption numbers that are hard to explain in any other way. Lesson 8. Here's a quick question asking yourself about for every customer you consider active. Is your product being used because it's valuable? Or is it present, available, and no one else has had the meeting about whether to stop? Those two situations can produce similar metrics in month 1. They produce very different metrics in month 7. The gap between them is detectable well before renewal if you're asking the right question. What is interesting about the deployment versus adoption gap is how often it surprises companies that had excellent pilots. The pilots succeeded, but conditions were controlled. A motivated champion, an engaged team, your people are paying close attention. But those conditions are useful, though they don't automatically generalize to the rest of the organization. So here's a design question worth genuinely grappling with as early as you can. What would your product need to look like for adoption to be self-sustaining? Not dependent on your team's presence, not dependent on the champion's energy, not dependent on anyone remembering that the implementation kickoff had excellent muffins. What would it take for a physician who is not in a single implementation meeting to open your product and find it obviously immediately useful? That's a lot harder than building a great pilot product, but it's what's going to cause your product to become unused, perhaps. Lesson 9, a quick thought experiment for anyone responsible for customer success. Your product is deployed in a health system. The department loves it. Clinical outcomes are measurable. You feel good about the renewable, which is maybe 6 months away. Now the CFO needs to find $12 million before the end of the fiscal year. Where does your product land in that conversation? If your answer is, I'm not really sure, it's not a failure, but it's a warning light. The CFO is not going to be looking at the same dashboard your champion is looking at. They're going to be looking at the budget lines, margin pressure, staffing costs, etc. And this insight is not where clinical value is irrelevant. It's that clinical value needs to find a financial translation that reaches the people who make budget decisions. And that translation needs to happen before renewal, ideally well before renewal, not during the week when everybody suddenly discovers the CFO has a calendar too. What's it going to look like to have a conversation with the CFO in advance? Not the pitch, because they do not need another pitch, but to understand how they're thinking about the next fiscal year and where your product fits in that picture. Companies that do this systematically, they don't get surprised at renewal. Lesson 10. Here's a quick question that gets to the heart of many startup health system relationships. When a health system is slow to engage, keeps deferring meetings, does not move quickly on a pilot, seems interested but nothing advances, what should you conclude? A lot of founders conclude that they're resistant to change. They don't really want to innovate. They are not ready. Sometimes a better explanation is kinder and more practical. The health system may already be fully committed to the innovation it has the capacity to resource. A health system in any given year has a ton of things that they want to do and a limited number of organizational implementation slots. Not unlimited capacity for change, but a constrained number of commitments that IT can support, clinical leadership can sponsor, and the organization can execute without compromising the stability of care delivery. That is not a rejection. It's alignment work, and the alignment work is real. So you got to do it. It's the hard work. Lesson 11. Has anyone ever ended a meeting by telling you that they had you, quote, on the list? Yes, of course they have. Healthcare has many lists. Some are sacred, some are operational. Some are probably maintained by a heroic person named Linda, who is the only one who knows where this spreadsheet lives. Now, here's the real question. At that moment, what did you actually know? You knew the person you spoke with found the conversation worthwhile. You knew they wrote something down. You knew they were not saying no. All powerful conversation signals. What you didn't know was, where does that list live? Who reviews this list? How does something get onto the list? How does something get off the list? How often? What criteria determines what advances? Whether the person who mentioned the list has authority over it, or whether it has an informal note somewhere made with good intentions during a very full week. What I find useful about this pattern about being on the list of what's important or not is that it's usually not dishonest on anyone's part. The list may very well be real. The intention may be genuine. But health systems are complex enough and the external pressures on them constant enough that a list from 6 months ago can get buried under whatever acute problem is consuming everyone's attention this week. Look at what happened with the pandemic, for example. Happens all the time in much smaller ways. So the useful question is not, should I trust the list, but what would tell me whether this list is active? A meeting ends with a specific next step, a name, a date, a question to be answered. It's evidence of motion. A meeting that ends with, we have you on the list, may be a friendly pause rather than a commitment. Design your pipeline around the difference between these two. Lesson 12. I want to end with this one because it involves a product lesson that is genuinely generous if you let it be. You built a self-serve admin portal. You built it because the IT departments told you they wanted control. You listened to your customers. You were responsive. You shipped the feature that they asked for. And then it sat mostly unused. So here's the real question. Did IT want control? Or did they want confidence that control would be available if they needed? Often it's the second one. And there's a meaningful product insight in that distinction. IT teams in health systems are operating at capacity, managing existing systems, fielding requests from clinical operations that never stop, and absorbing the downstream consequences of many prior technology decisions. When they say that they want a self-service portal, what they mean is we do not want to feel dependent. We want to know we could intervene if something went wrong. That is a confidence need. That is not a control need, and it may have a different solution. The solution may be bigger than a portal. It may be a relationship and response process that makes IT feel genuinely safe because your team is paying attention, because changes are communicated proactively, because problems get caught early, because support is clear, and because no one has to go on a scavenger hunt to find the person who can help. The companies that understand this discover that fully managed, transparently operated service cannot be just acceptable to health IT teams, but preferred once trust is established. And IT teams who trust the vendor can become one of the most effective internal advocates that the vendor has. That outcome is available only when you take the thoughtful, demonstrate consistent service and support, and that you're worthy of this trust. So let's try to pull all of these 12 threads into something coherent. Every pattern we explored has the same underlying shape. There's an assumption about how systems work. The assumption is logical, sometimes even based on things the health system said out loud. The useful question is not, why was the assumption wrong or what was the assumption missing? Often the missing piece is capacity, budget ownership, workflow reality, implementation risk, or the difference between enthusiasm and authority, or the difference between a clinical win and a funded operating priority. None of this means that the health systems are irrational. They're complex in the technical sense of the word. Competing constraints, distributed authority, finite resources, a mandate to deliver care regardless of whatever implementation project is currently behind schedule. They're going to make decisions that look slow from the outside and feel urgent from the inside. They say yes to things that cannot resource and no to things that they genuinely want. Learning to work with that complexity is not a compromise. It's the craft, and encouraging part of it is learnable. For builders, sellers, I want to add one question to the ones we have discussed. What do you know about the specific health system and what it has struggled with technology implementation before? Maybe last week, maybe last month, maybe last year. And how are you designing specifically to avoid repeating that pattern? That question is what separates vendors from partners. And partners are the ones that survive renewal and eventually become the kind of relationship that does not need to be resold from scratch every year. For buyers, the question I would leave you with is this. How honest are you being with the startups you meet? Not about whether you like their product, but about whether you actually are, in terms of capacity, priority, readiness, able to accommodate what they do. A startup that understands your real situation can do something useful with it. Be honest. One that is operating on a politely optimistic picture of your readiness cannot help you out. The cost of that gap is usually carried by both parties over a much longer timeline than either would choose. And the business model question. There's always a business model question, quietly sitting in the corner with excellent posture. Almost everything we have explored today becomes easier when the payment pathway is explicit from the beginning. Not aspirational, not we'll figure this out after we prove clinical value, but explicit. Who pays? From what budget? Under what contractual structure? And what happens to that structure if the product works better than expected or if the CFO's priorities shift? Establishing that clarity early is not unromantic. It's generous. It's what makes everything else possible. It is what allows a promising pilot to become a contract to become a relationship, and a relationship to become the kind of collaboration that actually changes how a healthcare delivery system delivers care. That's what you came to build, so build for it. Real questions, real experience, real decisions, and the business models that make all of that actually possible. If any of today's questions landed somewhere useful, if they surfaced something worth examining in your own work, or opened up a line of thinking you had not been following, I'd genuinely like to hear about it at our GitHub community discussions board. A lot of what we talked about today seems obvious to some, but for those of you who are entering the market, it's going to be very, very strange to you how some of these large healthcare operations systems works. And if you've ever lived through one of these patterns and come out of the other side with some hard-won lesson to share, a practical workaround, a lesson, a question you wish somebody had asked 6 months earlier, that's exactly where the conversation this community exists to have. If you need to post anonymously, that's okay too. We're going to bring it in without attribution. There's no shortage of people trying to build better healthcare technology. What we need more of is honest, generous conversations about what actually makes it work. There are a ton of problems associated with the way that healthcare technology is built. There's a ton of problems with how healthcare technology is marketed, sold, delivered, operated, innovation being diffused. The problems are endless, but that's where the opportunities are endless as well. We need the conversations. We need the conversations to be as open as possible. This is the Shahid Shah Show. And until next time, keep innovating, stay practical, and be kind to the people doing hard work in complicated places.